Alright, so in my last video about the Ryzen and Navi launch, I took care of you mid-tier level gamers, and now today, I'm taking care of you budget gamers because we're taking a look at my personal favorite products of this launch, the Ryzen 5 3400G and the Ryzen 3 3200G. Let's have a look. Hey, welcome to Zach's Tech Turf. Today we're going to be benchmarking and comparing the 3400G and the 3200G and also comparing it to last year's generation as well. And if you're new here and you want to see more PC hardware, PC building videos, then hit that subscribe button down below and also that notification bell. That way you never miss an episode. But before we get into it, let me quickly pay some bills. Today's video is brought to you by Pulseway, which is a really neat remote monitoring and management software that I've actually deployed across my entire network down here in my studio. Pulseway is an all-in-one network management platform that allows you to remotely monitor and even control all of your devices that you installed the lightweight client on, which by the way, pretty much every operating system is supported. I personally really like the phone application because it allows me to quickly see what's going on with all of my devices, such as their temperatures, what processes are running, and I can even run scripts and perform Windows updates no matter where I'm at in the world. For us PC gamers, this is perfect because it allows us to start up those lengthy Windows updates while we're away, so we know our gaming rigs are 100% good to go when we get home. There's also pages and pages of notification settings to configure so you can get all sorts of alerts from your devices. Head on down to the first link in the description to score yourself a free version account which supports up to 2 devices, or use discount code ZTT to save 2 months off your next subscription. Alright, so before getting straight into the benchmarks, and unlike my last video, I do want to quickly talk about what exactly these two APUs are because there's surprisingly not a lot of content about these up on YouTube yet. First up, both of these processors are actually APUs, meaning that they have built-in integrated graphics unlike the rest of the Ryzen lineup. Both of these APUs are built off last year's Zen Plus architecture and not this year's 7nm Zen 2, so that's definitely something to be aware of as well. For specs, the 3200G is packing 4 cores and 4 threads with a base clock of 3.6 GHz and a boost clock of 4.0 GHz. This is up from 3.5 and 3.7 from last year's 2200G. The 3400G is 4 cores and 8 threads with a base clock of 3.7 GHz and a boost clock of 4.2 GHz. This is also up from last year's 2400G, which had 3.6 and 3.9. These are obviously some pretty impressive little improvements as far as the CPU processing power goes, but as far as integrated graphics, the 3400G is rocking the exact same Vega 11 chip that last year's 2400G was rocking, and the 3200G is rocking the same Vega 8 chip that last year's 2200G was rocking. One other important upgrade to note is that with last year's APUs, your RAM frequency was maxed at 2666 MHz, and now with this generation you can crank it up to 2933 MHz, which will definitely give us a performance increase on its own. As far as benchmarking goes, I did not overclock these chips at all. You guys know my motto by now. I like to show you the performance that you can expect right out of the box. I also didn't change any of the BIOS settings, such as like the amount of VRAM or anything like that. Pretty much the only thing that I changed from stock was the RAM frequencies that I just talked about. With that being said, I definitely want to hear from you guys if you want to see more content with possibly some overclocking, and I'll definitely be making a separate video showing these APUs with dedicated graphics cards very soon. For our testing platform, today I have these APUs installed in our normal testing rig, which is rocking an Asus Prime X470 Pro motherboard with the latest BIOS version to support these chips, 16GB of Corsair Vengeance RAM, which will be clocked at 2933 MHz, other than for the 2200G, which I'll also be testing, and finally all of these games are installed on a 500GB ADATA SSD. All of these benchmarks will be in 1080p, and speaking of that 2200G, I decided to throw that in the mix so you could see the generational improvement from the 2200G to the 3200G, but sorry, I don't have a 2400G in the studio. Another thing to note is that the footage you're about to see was actually recorded with a 5700 XT graphics card installed, because these APUs without a GPU don't really record gaming footage too well, and it definitely affects the performance. The first game up was Fortnite, and wow, I wish you could have seen the look on my face when benchmarking this one as soon as I popped into the lobby before the game even started. I instantly could tell that there was a huge jump from the 2200G to the 3200G, and you can clearly see that with these results. In 1080p and Pro settings, which is basically just low with epic view distance, the 3400G averaged 71, while the 3200G actually averaged slightly more than 74, which was very weird, but this is the only weird result that I got, so I won't get too worried about this one. Next up was PUBG, also in 1080p and Pro settings, which is basically very low, and the 3400G averaged 52, while the 3200G averaged 49, and I just wanted to point out that the generational improvement from the 2200G to the 3200G is basically the difference between playable and not playable in 1080p, which is just awesome to see. After that, I fired up the Rainbow Six built-in benchmarking tool, and in 1080p and low settings, the 3400G did way better with a 90 FPS average, while the 3200G still gave a very impressive 73 FPS average. Counter-Strike Global Offensive was up next, and in 1080p and low, the 3400G and 3200G both performed just around that 144 Hz mark, with the 3400G just doing slightly a few more frames per second better. Also a huge difference from last year's 2200G. Getting into the tougher to run games, I fired up Shadow of the Tomb Raider with only DirectX 11 enabled, and in 1080p with the lowest settings, the 3400G averaged 28 and the 3200G averaged 24. You probably want to play this one in 720p if you ask me. The dreaded and insanely tough to run Assassin's Creed Odyssey followed up next, and in 1080p and low settings, we got pretty much the exact same results and the same scaling as the previous Shadow of the Tomb Raider benchmark. Following that, I fired up Far Cry New Dawn, and in 1080p and low settings, yep, you guessed it, we got pretty much the exact same results again. All three of these APUs averaged a bit under 30 FPS, but with the proper scaling from chip to chip. These last three benchmarks go to show that the graphically demanding games don't see that much of an improvement from last generation, but the more CPU bound games like Fortnite and CSGO have a huge bump in performance. And for our last gaming benchmark, I used Mordhau during an actual online match, and in 1080p and low settings, the 3400G averaged 42, while the 3200G averaged 39. And finally, the last benchmark I ran was 3D Mark Firestrike. This one obviously didn't look that great with these super budget CPUs, but it allows us to easily see the difference in performance. As you can see with these scores, we get a pretty solid bump in performance from chip to chip. Alright, so with these results out of the way, I'm honestly pretty blown away by the difference between the 2200G and the 3200G. You can clearly tell that all of the difference was because of the CPU improvements, as there was no integrated graphics performance, but on the other hand, I'm actually not that excited about the difference between the 3200G and the 3400G. Overall, I wouldn't expect that big of a difference because the 3400G is only adding hyper-threading and a few hundred megahertz, but that's about the results that I would expect. But in my opinion, it's kind of hard to justify spending 50% more of your CPU budget on the 3400G compared to the 3200G. I think my official recommendation would be to buy the 3200G if you think that your build is going to stay a budget build for a while. There's really not a huge point in upgrading to the 3400G, but if you think that you're going to add a dedicated graphics card in the near future and turn that budget build into something pretty beefy, then you might as well go with the 3400G for now. Well, that wraps up my review of the Ryzen 5 3400G and Ryzen 3 3200G. As always, drop a comment about what content you want to see me do with these APUs next. After that, feel free to head on over to one of these two videos if you haven't seen them yet, and definitely hit that subscribe button because coming up next, probably some more Ryzen content. You don't want to miss that video.